Disclaimer: this video is of humorous nature only. The author does not seek to insult or humiliate anyone. The video may contain profanity. People under the age of 16 should refrain from watching this video. Story 1. That until a few years ago, Canada and Denmark had a war going on over a barren rock in the Arctic Ocean called Hans Island. It was called the Whiskey War. Every few months, the Canadian military would travel to the island where they'd find a Danish flag and a crate of Danish peppermint schnapps. The Canadians would remove the Danish flag, raise the Canadian flag, take the schnapps, and leave a crate of Canadian whiskey. Months would pass, but eventually the Danish military would arrive at the island, take the Canadian flag down, raise the Danish flag, take the whiskey, and leave behind another crate of schnapps. This went on for years. In 2022, the two countries finally decided to just divide the island in half, with one half being Canada and the other half being Denmark. Story 2. The Holy Roman Empire owes its existence to the misogyny of Pope Leo III. See, during the 9th century, no one in Europe believed that the Roman Empire had fallen. It had just moved capitals from Rome to Constantinople. It happens sometimes. Rome was getting old and decrepit and full of pagan art. Constantine did the right thing by moving the capital to a better trading position and founding a city based on Christian values. One could trace a line of political inheritance from Augustus to the current emperor, Leo IV. Only Leo died in 780. Fortunately, he had produced a son by then, Prince Constantine Zixings, with his wife, Irene. But the prince was only a child when his father died, and thus a regency was appointed. His mother, Irene. By all accounts, she was a reasonably good regent. Only when her son grew into adulthood, she refused to cede power. She even had him blinded when he started getting antsy about assuming sole authority. This was common. It was believed no imperfect vessel could rule God's empire, so rivals often had each other blinded to make them ineligible to rule. Only Constantine Eve's blinding was so violent that he died several days later. Around this time, either 797 or 798, Irene declared herself empress in her own right. Not a regent, not another man's queen. Empress. This scandalized Pope Leo, who firmly believed a woman could not occupy the Roman throne. He declared the empire in the East fallen, and that's why a fairly successful Frankish warlord named Charles got a surprise coronation on Christmas Day, 800. As the Pope declared the Holy Roman Empire restored in the West, giving Rome nerds yet another year to argue over when, trying to answer the question, when did the Roman Empire fall? Story 3. The sound made by the Krakatoa volcanic eruption in 1883 was so loud it ruptured eardrums of people 40 miles away, traveled around the world 4 times, and was clearly heard 3,000 miles away. That's like you standing in New York and hearing a sound from San Francisco. The earth rang like a bell for days, and it changed the weather all over the globe for years. Story 4. For me, as Halley's Comet appeared in the sky when Mark Twain was born in 1835. The comet moves in a 75 or 76-year orbit, and, as it neared Earth once again, Twain said, "I came in with Halley's Comet, and I expect to go out with it." Sure enough, he died on April 21, 1910, just as the comet made its next pass within sight of Earth. Story 5. In the 1970s, the Brazilian military was sent to intercept UFOs in Colares, in the Amazon Delta. The operation lasted for weeks and got officially called Operação Prado, Operation Saucer. That town got terrorized for months. Fishermen refused to go at sea after some of them were attacked by UFOs. The locals kept watch with weapons and fireworks every night. What's incredible is that, albeit this got to be the most do ejaculate or cum seminented case of UFO study in history, and specialists went there, such as Jacques Vallée, who inspired the French scientist in Spielberg's Encounter of the Third Kind. Almost nobody knows about it because it happened in rural Brazil. I mean, one can find full reports on the event complete with military testimony and encounters of UFO. And yet, a lot of UFO enthusiasts never heard of the strongest case ever. Story 6. The Battle of Castle Itter, in the closing days of Wei. To the best of my knowledge, it's possibly the only time US soldiers found themselves fighting alongside German soldiers against members of the S, in this instance to protect a bunch of French VIP prisoners, among them being Olympic tennis player Jean Barotra and Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who had been imprisoned there since 1943 or 1944. Story 7. An incident during the Battle of Arnhem in W2. Father Patagon was padre to the 2nd Parachute Battalion, and he would later tell of further amusing incidents which boosted the defenders' morale. At one point, he was sheltering under fire in a building along with Sergeant Jack Spratt, widely regarded as the battalion's joker. When he saw him coming, the sergeant remarked, "Well, Padre, they're throwing everything at us but the kitchen stove." No sooner had this been said than the building took a direct hit, and a section of the roof fell in. Once the dust cleared, it became apparent that, among other things that had fallen through, was, somehow, the kitchen stove. Spratt quipped, "I knew they were close, but I didn't realize they could actually hear us talking." Story 8. The Battle off Samar still blows my mind to this day. A task force of dinky destroyers, destroyer escorts, and small escort carriers faced down the wrath of the Japanese Center Force Fleet. This was headed by the Yamato, the largest battleship ever put to sea. And yet, despite all the superior firepower of the Japanese in this battle, they lost. They turned tail and ran, primarily due to the efforts of the USS Johnston and the USS Samuel B. Roberts. To add to the legend, the USS Samuel B. Roberts is now the deepest positively identified shipwreck. Story 9. The Pied Piper of Hamelin story is derived from an old inscription in the town of Hamelin, a recreation of an earlier inscription from the 13th century. The inscription states that on the 26th of February, 1238, 130 children were misled out of Hamelin by a piper dressed in colorful clothing, who took them into the cavalry foothills and were never seen again. There are a few theories about what happened, but really nobody knows what happened to Hamelin. The only part of the legend that seems to have been a later addition by the time of the Brothers Grimm is the detail about leading the rats out of the village first. If anything, this seems a rationalization for some earlier forgotten horror. Sweet Dreams. Story 10. The Battle of Cagayan. A group of Japanese pirates took the bay of this province in the Philippines when it was a Spanish colony. The peculiarity of this battle was that to combat these adversaries, a flotilla composed of Spaniards born in the New Spain and indigenous Tlaxcalans were used. Although the Spaniards were outnumbered, indigenous people and native Filipinos managed to repel the pirates. Ironically, many years later, the 201st Squadron, which was a Mexican Air Force, was attached to the 58th Fighter Group of the United States Air Force that helped liberate the Philippines from the Japanese Empire in World War II. Story 11. A terrific example of this is the Holocaust. The Germans killed millions upon millions of Jews, Slavic people, Romani, disabled people, LGBTQIAs, people of color, and others who didn't fit their idea of what a person should be like. The German leadership at the time considered such people to be less than human and thought their existence causes degradation of the genes of real humans. Okay, thank you. Story 12. There was an Egyptian pharaoh named Akhenaten who tried to convert Egyptian religion into monotheism. Obviously, he was hated, and the Egyptians erased any trace that he ever existed. Eventually, we found traces of a city he was trying to build in the late 1800s. But overall, this means that for over 3,000 years, the ancient Egyptians were successful in completely erasing any trace that one of their pharaohs existed. Story 13. The Bush family in general. You got a guy who tried to overthrow the American government in the 30s, whose son was nearly eaten by a cannibal in WE, who later became the director of the CIA, became the president, conducted possibly the most successful war in American history. His son then became president in an election draw that was helped decided by his brother. Story 14. We landed on the moon multiple times, and there's visible evidence of our landings, albeit visible with a telescope. Also, The artifacts the Apollo astronauts left on the moon include the contents of their bowel movements, and all are considered historical artifacts and are not to be disturbed according to the U.S. government. Story 15. The Dancing Plague in France. It was a psychological virus and more people getting infected, mostly BC, instead of quarantining the dancer. They had a main stage made, had musicians playing for them, and had people who were not affected dance with them, making them dance faster when they dropped down. It was said that 15 people died a day. Story 16. The mysterious disappearance of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 in 2014 is a modern-day enigma that has left the world baffled. How could a large commercial aircraft vanish without a trace, despite extensive search efforts spanning vast stretches of ocean? The lack of concrete answers and the multitude of theories, ranging from mechanical failure to deliberate sabotage, have fueled intense speculation and debate. Story 17. I forget his name, but there was a Chinese emperor that basically stopped the Industrial Revolution from happening over 500 years sooner because an invading force had the emperor's older brother, the rightful emperor. So he was basically throwing a war and lost all the northern territories in China. Just imagine if China started the Industrial Revolution 500 years before England. Thank you all for watching. Watch even more great stories on my channel.